Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. The purpose of this episode is to promote peace. As a pro-lifer, as a Christian, as a Catholic, I desire peace, not war. And whatever we can do to end war, we have an obligation to do. Pope John Paul II once said that, quote, war is always a defeat for humanity. Going on to say that, quote, violence and arms can never resolve the problems of man, close quote. War can be avoided through, quote, international law, honest dialogue, solidarity between states, the noble exercise of diplomacy. And it is a noble exercise. It's not weakness. If we truly consider ourselves to be pro-life Christians, then we must seek peace. War should always be the last option because it necessarily entails death and destruction of our sons and daughters. So speaking of pro-life, we're going to get back to the show in just a moment, but I want to take a moment to remind you that Real Estate for Life is the most pro-life way to buy or sell a home. I myself have used them twice, once to buy a home and once to sell my home, so I can personally vouch for realestateforlife.org. They'll pair you with a faith-based realtor who shares your values, and they will give a cut of their commission to the pro-life charity of your choice, and that is all without costing you a single penny. So to learn more, please go to realestateforlife.org. That's realestateforlife.org, and please let them know Christine Niles sent you. All right, so everyone and his mother has by now seen the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office between President Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on February 28th. So as a quick recap, here's the moment when things got tense.
What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine? Did you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
Note that 40 minutes of pretty calm discussion took place before that eruption. Calm, respectful, even as Zelensky was continually sort of pushing the envelope, making clear at that time that he was not ready for peace with Russia without a U.S. pledge for military intervention, something that Trump is just not going to do. And he's made clear he's not going to do that. So in any case, we all know the meeting was cut short. Zelensky was told to leave. And then after that, things basically went from bad to worse. He went to his friends in the EU, some who pledged their support, even military support, boots on the ground in Ukraine, while a number of them scolded Trump for being a so-called bully to the long-suffering leader of Ukraine. Then Zelensky went and made public comments claiming he saw as, quote, very, very far away, his words, any end to the war with Russia. And Trump went ahead and blasted him on social media, calling his comments, quote, the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky. And America will not put up with it for much longer. It is what I was saying. This guy doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing. And Europe, in the meeting they had with Zelensky, stated flatly that they cannot do the job without the U.S. So within hours of those comments that Zelensky made, that he saw the end of the war is very, very far away, Trump cut off all military spending on Ukraine and halted arms being shipped to Ukraine. And what's interesting is that in less than a day after that, Zelensky capitulated, tweeting that he was ready to negotiate peace and ready to sign the minerals deal, which he initially rejected 3 times. So what he didn't understand at the time that he rejected that minerals deal is that it was precisely the key to Ukraine's security. Because once you secure U.S. interest and investment in Ukraine's minerals, the U.S. now has a stake in the country, a real stake. going to send businesses over there, money over there, investments over there in the land itself, investment in the land itself. And Russia understands that. And Russia knows that now it can't really touch Ukraine without also touching U.S. interests, U.S.'s own stake in the country. So this understanding, I think, has finally dawned on Zelensky, that this minerals deal is really the key to guaranteeing Ukraine's security and thus guaranteeing peace in the area. So at this point, he is practically begging Trump to sign the deal as of this taping. Also, what's interesting, too, is that the CIA has announced that it has partially cut off intelligence cooperation with Ukraine. So it's no longer sharing intelligence with Ukraine, which it used to do, that would enable Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia, to send missiles deep inside Russia. Some are calling Trump a Putin stooge and a Russian asset. What else is new? But me, I see this as a de-escalation of the war, a step away from the eventual path to World War III, if we don't put an end to this conflict as soon as possible. Now, before we even get into all the nitty-gritty, let me just make clear, I am not pro-Russia, I am not pro-Ukraine. I am pro-peace. And I'm hoping that this episode will give you some very needed context and background with regard to the current conflict in Ukraine. I mean, you simply cannot discuss the war in Ukraine fluently without understanding this absolutely crucial background and context. I don't claim to be a foreign policy expert, but everything I'm going to talk to you about tonight is taken directly from declassified documents from the State Department. It's on the National Security Archive. I'm more than happy to post a link and you can read the words for yourself. Nothing that I'm saying here is quoting Putin. I don't quote him once. So don't anybody out there call me a Putin stooge, which is just stupid. It's just dumb, that response. Oh, you're just a Russian asset. You're just a Putin puppet. That's what people say when they don't have an argument. I'm neither pro-Ukraine nor pro-Russia. And that's the position I've had since the very beginning of this. I'm pro-peace. And I know that there are bad actors on all sides here. On all sides. Okay, let's be completely honest. There really aren't any good guys in this war. But all of this really matters to each of us, especially as pro-life Christians, pro-life Catholics. All of this matters to us. So let's take just a moment to watch this very brief excerpt, this brief infographic.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, the political and security situation in Europe changed dramatically. NATO, which was originally a defensive alliance, began expanding steadily. In 1999, countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined. Then in 2004, NATO added Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In the following years, Croatia and Albania became members in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and North Macedonia in 2020. As NATO continued to expand eastward, Russia became increasingly alarmed. Its greatest fear was that Ukraine, which shares a 2,300-kilometer border with Russia, might eventually be invited to join the alliance. For Moscow, that would have been a huge strategic problem. The idea of NATO moving closer to Russia's doorstep was something it simply couldn't overlook.
So first, some basics. What is NATO? NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed in Washington, D.C. in 1949 and originally consisted of 12 nations: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the UK, and of course, the US. And NATO was formed essentially to counteract the Soviet Union, which was at the time a grave threat. It was home to godless and repressive communism, whose ideology, whose gulags have killed many more, hundreds of millions of people than any other ideology in history, a very evil empire. So NATO was formed to ensure the Soviet Union could not expand its territory into Europe or elsewhere. And NATO members made a pact that if one of its members was attacked, the others would come to its aid. Since 1949, 20 more countries have joined NATO. In response to the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance that acted as a counterweight to NATO. The Warsaw Pact consisted of 7 Eastern European countries. The Cold War had officially begun. Now, as we all know, Ukraine has been asking to join NATO for years. And this is the bone of contention in this war between Ukraine and Russia. But more on that in just a moment. I want to turn your minds back to June 12th, 1987, when President Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and gave a historic speech, made a demand to Mikhail Gorbachev, then leader of the Soviet Union, to tear down the Berlin Wall.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Berlin Wall is considered one of the most enduring symbols of the Cold War, a war that lasted almost 50 years between the Soviet Union and the West, especially the United States, the two superpowers. This was a time of great fear. Truly it was. You can't relate to it now necessarily, but for those who grew up under the Cold War, people were truly afraid. Nuclear weapons were proliferating on both sides, and people truly feared that they would wake up one day to a nuclear holocaust. People were building nuclear bunkers. This was a real fear for people. Now, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the potential destruction with regard to nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II exploded with a force of approximately 15 kilotons and 23 kilotons, respectively. Up till then, they were the most powerful explosive force in human history. Until 1961, when the Soviet Union flew a plane over a remote chain of islands in the Arctic and dropped a hydrogen bomb they had nicknamed the Tsar Bomba, Russian for the Emperor of Nuclear Bombs. It fell with the force of 50 megatons. That's 50,000 kilotons. Remember, the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima was only 15 kilotons. The Tsar Bomba was 50,000 kilotons. That is more than 3,000 times the power of the atomic bombs the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima. The Tsar Bomba incinerated everything within 22 square miles and left a mushroom cloud 100 miles high. Russian structures on the ground that were 100 miles away were seriously damaged. So the dropping of that bomb seriously escalated the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, causing panic throughout the U.S. because we now knew our enemies had in their possession the deadliest force known to mankind. To this day, that bomb remains the most powerful explosive ever made. And today, Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, with the U.S. coming in a close second. Now, multiple other countries also possess nuclear weapons to a far lesser degree, but all of them together are enough to blow up the world several times over. That is not an exaggeration. But let's go back to Reagan. His presidency was marked significantly, as we know, by his fight against communism. In this sense, he was kindred spirits with another leading figure at the time, also determined to take down communism, but through spiritual means, Pope John Paul II. The Pope's historic 1979 visit to communist Poland, a regime that he grew up under, that he and his family and friends suffered under, was the first powerful salvo in his spiritual war against godless communism.
In earlier days, as priest and bishop, he'd often hiked in his native mountains here with youth groups, sung around the campfire. The words of one song they sang now together, "Mountaineer, aren't you sad to leave? Aren't you sad? Come back to your mountain home." And another sung frequently in Poland with political overtones about the Black Madonna, at whose shrine the Pope prayed today. The Black Madonna is an icon painting of a dark-skinned Virgin Mary, credited with miracles including saving Poland from invaders 300 years ago, at which time she was named the Queen of Poland. She rules still as the central religious object in Poland's nationalistic Catholicism, commanding an allegiance the communist regime does not approach. The central figure in Poland's nationalistic religion is this singing Pope, who does not know when he will return to his country. As the day drew to a close, they sang an old Polish hymn to the evening.
And just as a sidebar, I will add that I've been reading about the image of Our Lady of Yasna Gora. Absolutely amazing. I've always known about the image of Our Lady of Yasna Gora, also known as Our Lady of Częstochowa in Poland, the great shrine there. I had no idea the power of this image. Miracles, miracle after miracle after miracle, literally raising people back from the dead, miraculous cures, helping souls out of purgatory, all sorts of things. I think I may do a different episode on that, but it blows your mind. Amazing. All right, but returning to Pope John Paul II, he and Reagan were bound together not just in their fight against communism, but also by the fact that both of them had suffered assassination attempts. Both of them were shot. Both had bullets pierced through their chests, bullets that came within inches of their heart. Both of them almost dying, yet surviving. Now, I've done a prior episode on John Paul's heroic witness during that time, especially in extending mercy to his would-be assassin, Mehmet Ali Agca, who would then go on 30 years later to convert to the Catholic faith. Also, the miraculous way Our Lady protected him on the day that he was shot, the Feast of Our Lady Fatima, May 13th, 1981. That date was not a coincidence. But if you haven't seen that episode, it's titled, "Should We Forgive Those Who Aren't Sorry?" When Reagan gave that historic speech, urging Gorbachev to tear down this wall, little did he know that only 2 years later, on November 9th, 1989 to be exact, when the border crossing gate at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint was lifted, that the Berlin Wall would effectively come tumbling down. Now, that action didn't come without approval from Moscow. East Germany, which of course, as we know, was under communist control at the time, contacted Soviet headquarters for their approval first, and that approval was granted. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, breaking up into 15 newly independent nations, among them Ukraine. Now let's back up to 1990. East and West Germany, reunification with the express approval of the Soviet Union. So as I mentioned, East Germany under communist control. East Germany first emerged from the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany after World War II. And so the reunification of East and West Germany into one democratic nation as a full member of NATO, this is very key. This is very key. Came with assurances by the U.S. to the Soviet Union, which led them to approve the reunification. What were those assurances? Okay, before anyone tells me that this is Russian propaganda, I'm just quoting Putin, absolutely not. Everything I'm telling you, like I said, is taken straight from declassified State Department documents from back in 1989, 1990, 1991, 94, 95, and onwards. They're posted on the National Security Archive. They were obtained through FOIA requests. You could read them yourself. I'll be glad to provide a link. So like I said, anyone's telling you that what I'm about to tell you is false and just Russian propaganda, blah, 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 they're either ignorant or they are flat out lying. In February 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker met with Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev, who said, quote, "NATO expansion is unacceptable." Baker agreed and told Gorbachev not once, but 3 times that NATO would expand, quote, not 1 inch eastward. His exact words verbatim, not 1 inch eastward. Go read the documents yourself, please. Eastward, of course, meaning towards Russia. 3 times that was promised. He went on to say, Baker went on to say, quote, not only for the Soviet Union, but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. His words to Gorbachev. His promise to Gorbachev. The next day, the West German chancellor promised Gorbachev NATO would not expand. So you've got Germany now promising Gorbachev that. After that, the British foreign minister promised the same. Okay, so now you've got Great Britain giving him the same assurance. And then came French President François Mitterrand, also assuring Gorbachev that they understood Russia's security interests about preventing NATO expansion. So you've got now at least three other countries backing up U.S.'s assurance to Gorbachev of no NATO expansion. British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, also met personally with Gorbachev, saying, quote, we must find ways to give the Soviet Union confidence that its security would be assured. So like I said, U.S., Britain, West Germany, France, repeatedly promising and reassuring Russia no eastward NATO expansion. In fact, they didn't stop there. They assured Gorbachev that NATO would move its focus away from military strength, more towards political and economic alliances. They were open to welcoming Russia to play a larger and friendlier role in Europe, a unified Europe. So based on those assurances, based on those promises, Gorbachev agreed to the unification of East and West Germany. Very huge deal. The next year in 1991, the day after Christmas, the Soviet Union would officially dissolve. The Cold War would come to an official end. The Warsaw Pact was over. Like I mentioned, among the newly formed states, out of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine would emerge. That same year, Ukraine would declare independence from Russia. Now, just a few years later, in 1994, under President Bill Clinton, the U.S. would break its promise and start pushing heavily for the expansion of NATO. This naturally angered Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who told Clinton, quote, in a meeting, a very emotional meeting, and again, we have the entire transcript of that meeting, you go read it yourself, quote, for me to agree to the borders of NATO expanding towards those of Russia, that would constitute a betrayal on my part of the Russian people. There are multiple back and forth communiques, letters between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, in which Clinton repeatedly assures Yeltsin throughout 1994 and then 1995 that he is not interested in NATO expansion at the moment, that if any expansion happens at all, it will happen, in his words, slowly and gradually. Yeltsin writes this letter on November 30th, 1994, which includes, quote, I shall frankly say that against the background of our promising joint efforts, one completely fails to understand the reasons behind a new revitalizing of the discussion on speeding up the broadening of NATO. We have agreed with you that there will be no surprises, that first we should pass through this phase of partnership, whereas issues of further evolution of NATO should not be decided without due account to the opinion and interests of Russia. But by the end of the year, Russia recognizes that Clinton's been speaking out of both sides of his mouth, telling Russia one thing while actually pushing harder for NATO expansion to Western allies. In one letter from Christmas Eve 1994, Clinton falsely tells Yeltsin, quote, I want to reaffirm our September understanding that the future development of NATO will proceed gradually and openly. Going on to write that he wants, quote, to ensure a full transparency regarding both actions and intentions on both our parts. Well, unfortunately, on the part of Clinton, there was no transparency. What he told him was not true. Clinton was pushing to his Western allies for rapid expansion of NATO. It was actually in Clinton and Yeltsin's May 10th, 1995 meeting that a very emotional Boris Yeltsin confronted Clinton. This is what he said. I want to get a clear understanding of your idea of NATO expansion because now I see nothing but humiliation for Russia if you proceed. And Gorbachev would actually repeat that later on, humiliation. How do you think it looks to us if one bloc continues to exist while the Warsaw Pact has been abolished? It's a new form of encirclement. If the one surviving Cold War bloc expands right up to the borders of Russia, many Russians have a sense of fear. What do you want to achieve with this if Russia is your partner? They ask. I ask it too. Why do you want to do this? We need a new structure for pan-European security, not old ones. That same year, you have the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine pledges to give up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees from the US, UK, and Russia that they would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and would provide aid in the case of Russia's invasion. So, just a quick clarification, people have been citing the Budapest Memorandum to accuse the U.S. of breaking its promise to Ukraine, to accuse the U.S. that, Trump, you're breaking this memorandum. You have to continue providing all the support to Ukraine. This is based on a misunderstanding of the terms of the Budapest Memorandum. Those terms did not require military intervention by the U.S. What it obligated was support, aid, which is exactly what we've been doing for Ukraine for the past however many years. Hundreds of billions of dollars sent to Ukraine, arms, weapons sent to Ukraine. We have fulfilled our part of the bargain. That bargain, those terms do not require military intervention. So anybody telling you that the Budapest Memorandum requires that, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand the terms. The Budapest Memorandum does not require us to continue sending hundreds of billions of dollars to a pointless and unwinnable war. More arms, more weapons to further escalate this war to the brink of World War III. It does not require that. So in 1997, Gorbachev essentially repeats Boris Yeltsin's concerns. This is on April 16th, 1997. There's an increasing talk of NATO expansion, and this is what Gorbachev says.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences. So my question is this a new strategy? I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve. Glasnost, free elections, political pluralism, the problems of concern to you. If not, it'll be more difficult. Thank you.
In that same year, see how disdainful the U.S. is with regard to Russia's concerns. Here is Joe Biden dismissing and mocking Russia's concerns about NATO expansion.
I had one interesting comment. Our conversation with Ziganov was repeated with Lebed. They talked about they don't want this NATO expansion. They know it's not in their security interests and on, and said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Ziganov, lots of luck in your senior year. Good luck. And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious. I said that to them, and these were, and they know, I knew, they knew, everybody knows that is not an option. And everybody knows, every one of those leaders acknowledges and needs, and they resent it. But they need to look west. And the question is, whether this is designed to completely shut them out, but not in terms of whether or not it's a direct military security threat.
Regardless of all this, Bill Clinton moves forward. Here he is on March 20th, 1998.
Now we have to finish what America started 4 years ago, welcoming Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic into our alliance. If you look around at who's in the room today, you can see that they are more than willing to be a good partner. They will make NATO stronger. They will make Europe safer. And in so doing, they will make America and our young people more secure. They will make it less likely that the young men and women in uniform who serve under General Shelton and the other generals here and their successors in the 21st century will have to fight and die because of problems in Europe.
He got what he wanted. The next year, in 1999, as we've already seen, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. Poking the bear, that bear being Russia. So whatever happened to U.S.'s promise to the Soviet Union that NATO would move, quote, not 1 inch eastward? What happened? Whatever you think about Russia or Ukraine, the facts are clear. We broke our promise. And not just that, we broke it repeatedly. Russia has made clear, and it makes clear today, its bottom line is that Ukraine can never become a member of NATO. But in 2008, President George W. Bush supported Ukraine's membership in NATO. He supported it. And guess who opposed it? France and Germany. France and Germany opposed it because Russia, for obvious reasons, objected. But in spite of that, NATO responds, promising Ukraine it will be a member one day, but doesn't give a specific timeline. Poking the bear. In 2014, let's fast forward, 2014, you have the Color Revolution in Ukraine, in which there's, at this point, no doubt whatsoever, because there's way too much information and evidence, people openly discussing it, the CIA is deeply involved in the overthrow of democratically elected Yanukovych. Anybody, I was called a Russian stooge for saying this. And this, it's hard for me to take that sort of thing seriously because literally Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, there's a very famous leaked phone call that deeply embarrassed the U.S., where she is openly talking about staging the coup. She's already chosen her man, Yatsenyuk. She names him several times in the conversation with the other man, George Piat, that she's speaking with. And they're both plotting and planning on how they're going to achieve this overthrow and how they're going to put Yatsenyuk in power. They're upset with Yanukovych because he desired to maintain neutrality and agreed not to pursue NATO membership. That's where he stood. Now, the neocons claim that Russia bribed him with millions of dollars and pressured him not to enter into an EU trade agreement. And that's what caused the unrest. There's different information from both sides. But the fact remains, with the help of our CIA, Ukraine installed Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Like I said, handpicked by the CIA because his political ideology is aligned with ours. Here's Victoria Nuland admitting to Congress in 2016 how deeply embedded the U.S. was in Ukraine during and after this time, and we were practically running the country.
And U.S. advisors serve in almost a dozen Ukrainian ministries and localities, helping to deliver services, eliminate fraud and abuse, improve tax collection, and modernize Ukrainian institutions. With U.S. help, newly vetted and trained police officers are patrolling the streets of 18 Ukrainian cities. In courtrooms across Ukraine, free legal aid attorneys funded by the U.S. have won 2/3 of all the acquittals in the countries. Treasury and State Department advisors have helped Ukraine shutter over 60 failed banks and protected the assets of depositors. And since there can be no reform in Ukraine without security, over $266 million of our support has been in the security sector, training 1,200 soldiers and 750 Ukrainian National Guard personnel, and supplying life-saving gear. In FY16, we are continuing that training and equipment of more of Ukraine's border guards, military, and Coast Guard.
It went beyond that. The CIA set up multiple staging points throughout Ukraine to continue its espionage, continue its spying on Russia, and whatever other intentions that they had towards Russia. And meanwhile, the U.S. under Biden, the previous administration, kept pushing and pushing for the idea of Ukraine to join NATO, all the while knowing very well that this was Russia's red line. Russia has made this clear for literally decades. And yet this was what Biden is pushing for, poking the bear. We keep poking the bear. So after the 2014 revolution, a number of ethnic Russians refused to recognize Ukraine's new leader, instead allying themselves with Russia. And they voted an overwhelming 92% to be annexed by Russia. Now, okay, people say that that's just Russian propaganda, that the vote was rigged, that Russian soldiers went and pressured people to vote the way that they wanted, and that this was just an illegitimate referendum that Europe and no other country recognizes. Fine. I actually think there's propaganda coming from both sides. And anybody who knows the history of the CIA and how many regime changes around the world and in history that they have been directly involved in and that they have lied about, not just abroad, here as well in the United States. And we all know this, okay? After 4 years under Biden and the weaponization of the deep state and so many lies coming out even from our own intelligence community, we know there's propaganda coming out from both sides. So anyone who says it's very black and white and that Russia lies all the time, but we always tell the truth, give me a break. That's incredibly naive. America and its citizens are a great country and a great people. Its leaders, the people embedded in the deep state, not so much. A great deal of corruption, a great deal of evil. So don't be naive. There's propaganda coming from both sides. But in any case, Russia uses that as its justification for annexing Crimea in 2014. Also using, the justification that Sevastopol is a major naval base and they have to protect that. Now in 2022, which is really kind of the blow up of the current conflict, Russia claims that Ukraine is committing genocide against ethnic Russians in the Donbass and starts arming these, separatist rebels and then starts getting directly involved. Now, Ukraine claims that that's propaganda to justify its illegal seizure of that region. So once again, I think there's truth to both sides, just like I think there's propaganda coming out from both sides. I'm not so naive as to think the lies are only being told by one side. Two sides, and there's truth on both sides, just like there's propaganda on both sides. So now Ukraine's morale is very low. Its own men are fleeing the country by the thousands because they don't want to be sent to the front lines. They do not want to go to war. Ukraine has had an incredibly difficult time getting men to fight. They have no volunteers left. So what are they doing now? They're using what people have termed conscription gangs. Please just watch this clip from PBS.
If I refuse to be summoned, the only person who legally is supposed to be able to detain me is a policeman. But in reality, territorial recruitment officers have been bundling men into the back of vehicles and sending them off to training centers. If I refuse to be summoned, the only person who legally is supposed to be able to detain me is a policeman. But in reality, territorial recruitment officers have been bundling men into the back of vehicles and sending them off to training centers and then on to the front. Scores of videos of men being dragged off of the street have emerged on social media, and there are many more who have been deceived in other ways. Mikhailo, speaking to me independently of the military chain of command at his new base in Donbass, was tricked into driving straight to a training camp when he voluntarily updated his details at a medical commission office.
And before they took me to car, they was very polite. They smiled at me and they said, everything will be okay. No, don't worry, everything, just 2 hours and you will come back. And when I sit to their car, it's like, I was like a prisoner.
So how did that make you feel? You must have been very angry.
Yeah, I was confused, angry and lost about this. Because they even didn't give me time to go home to kiss my wife, to kiss my baby.
And here's a clip of a man being forcefully conscripted into war, pleading that he has a child alone at home. That is so hard to watch. And there's so many others as well that are, I'm not going to play them for you. They're so hard to watch. So heartbreaking. But multiply this scene by thousands of times. How many of these men, husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, are sent away, only to die a few weeks, months later, leaving behind widows, fatherless children, grieving parents and siblings? And for what? For those claiming saving Ukraine is saving democracy, please, Ukraine is not a democracy. Zelensky instituted martial law and he has banned elections. Now, you might argue that that has merit because Churchill, banned elections during World War II, and so he didn't have elections until the very end. You can make that argument. I don't know of any other country, though, that has done that. You can point to Britain during World War II. I don't know of any other country that's actually, any other democratic country, okay? There are plenty of dictatorships that do that. I don't know of any other democratic countries that have done that. But not just that, Zelensky has shut down political opposition. He shut down political opposition. He does not allow opposing political parties to run against him. He has censored and silenced critical press. Now, the rationale that he and Ukraine use is that they're pro-Russian or they're pushing Russian propaganda. That may be the case with some of them. That's not the case with all of them. The fact is, they criticize Zelensky. They criticize the war for many of the same reasons that I am critical of Zelensky and the war. Ipso facto, in their eyes, in Ukraine's eyes, in Zelensky's eyes, that makes them Russian agents. Ukraine would probably label me a Russian agent for producing this very show and shut me down if they could. Ukraine is not, at present, a democracy. It functions more like a dictatorship. Like I said, they silence political opposition. They silence the press. They do not currently believe in democratic principles. They do not have freedom of speech. They do not have freedom of worship. It is well known that Zelensky has officially shut down the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. He has persecuted and jailed its priests, once again using the excuse that they are Putin's stooges. Absolute nonsense. They are Christians trying to practice their faith. Some of them have been critical of the war. Some of them have been critical of Zelensky. So, of course, they have been silenced by Zelensky. Ukraine was ranked the most corrupt country in Europe just a few years ago. It was, you can look it up, ranked the most corrupt country in Europe. Corrupt as in politicians and leaders routinely accepting bribes. Foreign aid not going where it's intended, instead pocketed by government officials and others. There is no dispute, Ukraine remains one of the most corrupt countries on the globe. What else? It's one of only two countries in the world that has legalized commercial surrogacy, basically baby selling factories, rent-a-wombs, commercialized. Surrogacy is banned in most civilized countries. It's even banned in third world countries because of the abuse that it has led to. And you know what's really sad? Guess which other countries legalized commercial surrogacy? The US, right here. Very sad. Do a little research. Maybe I'll devote an episode to it, but commercial surrogacy is absolutely horrific. So many abuses. Babies being put up for sale to the highest bidder. Babies being abandoned, forgotten, mistreated, abused, in some cases killed. And parents who are not sufficiently vetted. Some parents, there are, cases of parents rejecting their surrogate babies if the babies turn out to be sick or disabled. Then they wind up in orphanages or who knows where, or they wind up dead. The mothers who volunteer to be surrogates very often come to deeply regret their decision. Now, of course, I've read about some happy endings, but overall, the entire industry, which rakes in billions and billions of dollars across the globe, it is horrific. It is actual human trafficking. And that takes place right there in Ukraine. I mean, there's so much more history that I simply cannot get into with regard to Ukraine and Russia. I can't do that because this show is already long and it would take hours and hours and hours. But all of this historical background is key to understanding the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, they have a history stretching back at least 1,000 years. I don't pretend to know every single aspect of their complex relationship. I don't pretend to be a foreign policy expert. But I do know, and the facts do bear it out, that the U.S., along with other European nations, promised Russia it would not expand NATO. And based on that promise, we got Russia to agree to one of the most crucial acts ever in the history of the 20th century, which led directly to the end of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and the end of the Cold War, all based on assurances by us and our Western allies that we would not expand NATO. And what did we do? We turned around and just a few years later broke that promise. Like I said, I liken it to poking the bear. If you know there's a sleeping bear, and you know that bear is terribly dangerous, and you know that bear can be cruel, and it doesn't act with fairness or justice, you know it's dangerous, yet you keep poking that bear, and poking him, and poking him. And all the while he's telling you, stop poking me. Stop it. Stop humiliating us. Or else. What do you think is going to happen if you keep poking, you keep humiliating, and you keep lying? At some point, that bear is going to rise up with all his might and all his strength and turn around and maul you, perhaps to death. And yes, it will be cruel, it will be horrible, it will be awful. And there's not necessarily any justification for it, not rationalizing any sort of that aggression. But what I'm saying, you can only poke and poke and poke and provoke so much, and then the bear responds. So why do we insist on poking the Russian bear? When Trump came into office and he said, very clearly he declared, Ukraine will never be a part of NATO.
You know, a big part of the problem was Russia for many, many years, long before Putin said you could never have NATO involved with Ukraine. Now, they've said that that's been like written in stone. And somewhere along the line, Biden said, no, they should be able to join NATO. Well, then Russia has somebody right on their doorstep, and I could understand their feeling about that. But there were a lot of mistakes made in that negotiation. And when I heard the way that Biden was negotiating, I said, you're going to end up in a war. And it turned out to be a very bad war. And it could escalate. That war could escalate to be much worse than it is right now.
That was the first step toward ensuring peace with Russia. A crucial step towards the U.S. keeping its initial promise not to expand NATO. My prayer as a Catholic is for peace. That should also be your prayer. And I truly do pray it with all my heart, because this matters to you, to me, and to everyone watching. Because if we do not stop, if we listen to those warmongers out there who keep provoking Russia, who keep pushing for Ukraine's membership in NATO, who keep wanting us to send hundreds of billions of dollars, while also sending arms and weapons and encouraging more and more fighting, who want to continue this pointless, cruel, and unwinnable war, as Ukraine's and Russia's sons and daughters continue to die by the millions, and maybe also British, French, German sons and daughters, if they start putting troops on the ground over there. All of this could take us to the brink of World War III, and that will have a direct effect on you, your family, your friends, your loved ones. Let me remind you, Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, bigger than ours. This is an unwinnable war. Ukraine, they're going to have to make concessions. That's simply how it is. They're going to have to make some concessions. That does not mean that the evil dictator wins. That evil dictator already thinks Russia has lost because it was unable to defeat Ukraine within the first 3 days of its initial attack. This has gone on years longer than Russia expected. So in that sense, Russia already feels like it's lost. That so-called evil dictator already thinks Russia has been humiliated for decades by the non-stop eastward expansion of NATO, right up to Russia's borders. This is not about winning or losing. It's about peace. And I, for one, am so glad that blow-up happened in the Oval Office for all the world to see. because it woke up a lot of Americans who otherwise weren't really that interested or that knowledgeable about the conflict. It opened our eyes, and the mask fell off Zelensky, whom the neocons were canonizing as a martyr and a saint. Instead of mindlessly posting Ukraine flags for your avatar and saying, oh, I stand with Ukraine, without really having a clear idea of what that means and what you stand for: more war, more dying, more death and destruction. What does that mean? More forced conscription so men can go off and leave their families behind to fight a pointless and unwinnable war? People are waking up to the realization that, we're sending all these hundreds of billions of dollars overseas. We don't know where it's really going. And why? Why are we doing this? Again, so we could lead our nation into a third world war against the biggest nuclear superpower in the world? What is the end game? There is no end game except assured mutual destruction. That's the end game for some of these people. So as a pro-life Christian, like I said, I want peace. You should want that too. And you should be thanking God every single day that he has sent us a president who desires peace, who is putting an end to this madness, who desires, instead of fanning the flames of war and continued death and destruction and sorrow and grief and terror, which would easily spread to the rest of Europe and even to our shores here in America. A president who's doing everything in his power to bring about a peaceful solution to satisfy all sides. Please pray for peace. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And in the words of St. Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward boldly.